In this lesson, we'll begin the process of controlling the rendered appearance of our particles. Okay, so in our previous lesson, we finished up with the overall behavior of our particles. Now we're ready to start focusing on some of the things that we can start to put into the rendering. Now, when it comes to using these Cinema 4D particles, there's a couple of different approaches that we could take. Now, one method could be to actually assign some sort of a piece of geometry to these particles, because what you'll notice is even though these do show up here in the viewport, if I press Alt-R on my keyboard to open up a interactive render region, you'll notice these particles don't actually show up in any form in the renderer. Okay, so here's a couple of different approaches that we could take. One approach would be maybe you actually want these particles to assume some sort of a shape. So we could take any piece of geometry inside of Cinema 4D, let's say maybe something like a basic cube. Now I can take that cube and set it to any size I want, maybe knock that size down to about 50 centimeters cubed. And now what you could do is take any object that you want and then drop it underneath that emitter in the hierarchy. Okay, so now that cube is underneath the emitter, and what we should see is if we play this back, it actually won't show the result here in the viewport, but what we should see now is if I hit render, again, Alt-R on my keyboard, you can see now those cubes, or rather this individual cube, now shows up as the particle shape. Now if we select the emitter, we could go to the Particle tab, turn on this Show Objects checkbox, and now it actually shows that cube here in the viewport as well. And again, we have full control over this. So if I now wanted to go back and make my cube a little bit smaller, just go back to the cube shape. We'll set its size down to about 10 centimeters cubed, and there we are. And any materials or any shaders that we apply to this cube should be reflected in the viewport and in the render itself. Okay, so that is one method of sort of assigning some sort of a rendered appearance to these particles. Now in my case, I'm going to take a slightly different approach because I really don't want these particles to look solid. Instead, remember, we're going for something that is maybe a little bit more sort of fog-like or sort of smoke-like. So in my case, I'm going to take a slightly different approach. So I really don't need this cube for my case, so I'll just remove that. I really just dropped that in just so you could see that there is one possibility of changing the rendered appearance. But what I'm going to do is to create a volumetric effect, I'll go down here to my Material Manager. Let's go to Create, Shader, and down toward the bottom there is an option for Pyrocluster. Now just so you can see that a little bit easier, I'll just rip off that menu, pull that up here, and Shader, again all the way down at the bottom, we have what's called a Pyrocluster. Now this is going to be really good for rendering volumetric effects, things like clouds, smoke, fog, that we want to apply either to a material or a surface or to our particles in this case. So what I'll do is just simply take this Pyrocluster material, just simply click and drag that directly onto my emitter. Now, if I come in here and try to render this, we still don't see any sort of rendered results in the viewport. So in addition to using the Pyrocluster, there is a couple of very, very important steps that we need to take. So the first thing we need to do is go back to our shader, and in order for these Pyrocluster materials to be rendered, we need to also add in a Pyrocluster volume tracer. So let's add that in. Here's our volume tracer over here. Now, the second important step that we need to go through is where do we actually connect this volume tracer node? Well, that needs to go onto an environment. So let's come up here. Let's drop in just a simple environment. And now take that Pyrocluster volume tracer, click and drag that onto the environment. Okay, so now this has basically told Cinema 4D that it needs to calculate this Pyrocluster material. And now, once again, if I press Alt-R on my keyboard, there we go. Well, one of the first things that you'll notice is now this Pyrocluster material takes quite a bit of time to render. You can see a huge increase in my render time now is being used up for the rendering of these particles. Right, so I'm just going to pause this for a moment while this finishes rendering out, because this could take a minute or two. Okay, so now that's finished up rendering, and if you take a look down in the lower corner of my screen, you can see that this took about 2 minutes and 40 seconds to render. Now that's a lot of render time for something that is really very, very simple. Now part of that is due to the fact that I do have quite a few particles in my scene. In this case, again, a little over 2,000 particles. So be aware that as you start to add in this pyrocluster, your render times will really start to slow down. Now, let me show you probably one of the most important things that you can do in order to speed the rendering of this pyrocluster up. So what we're going to do is go to this environment, and let's go into the pyrocluster volume tracer. Okay, we can access this from the object manager, or we could also just simply click on it down here in our material manager. So down in the pyrocluster volume tracer, we have what is called the render mode. Now here we have a few presets that we can choose from. Now these presets go from highest quality down to some lower qualities. Obviously the higher qualities are going to take a much greater amount of time to render, and there's some instances where unless you're dealing with really detailed smoke and volume effects, a lot of times you can get away with dropping your quality down to one of these lower values and see very little, if any, difference in the final result. So for example, let's switch this to the hazy preset. And we'll just move this around and make that update. Let's compare the render times using this hazy preset. Okay, now in this case, this render, if you look down in the lower corner, only took about 18 seconds. So a huge increase in the overall quality. Now, these render mode presets that we have in the volume tracer are really controlling this world step size and this ray transparency limit. Now, this is a pretty good value. Again, you can see a much more improved render time. Not really a lot of change in quality, again, because I'm really using something that's relatively simple. But sometimes what I like to do is to actually switch this to a user control. And now that unlocks these attributes, and we can come in here now and start to introduce our own values. So what I would recommend doing is starting with this world step size, start with a really high value, something that maybe is just an astronomically high value, maybe 50. The higher this world step size, the faster your renders will progress, but you may start to notice a little bit of a difference or a drop in some of the quality or some of the detail of your pyrocluster. In my case, I've taken this world step size up to 50. Now, we're only at about a 3-second render, but in my case, this still looks pretty good. And again, unless you're trying to get some really highly detailed and intricate patterns in your volume, a lot of times you can get away with bumping this up to some really high values and save yourself a ton of rendering time. Okay, so now that we have the pyrocluster volume tracer set up, and now we have the pyrocluster material applied to our emitter, what we can start to do in our next lesson is begin focusing on some of the pyrocluster attributes that we can start to control in order to really change the overall appearance of these rendered particles.